Welcome, everyone, those here and those that will join later on. Welcome to the fourth talk in the HNR online seminar series. We still have one more talk for this spring series, but really excited for this one. We're going to hear from Minja Bujakovic from the European University Institute, who's going to talk about the network and the network continuity from the socialist to the communist women's movement before or a bit during the First World War, so 1906 to 1920. We're happy to hear from Minja about her use of networks and the history that she's working on. So it'll be roughly 30 to 40 minutes, however long it takes. It's your time. We'll hear a talk, and then afterwards open for questions, comments, thoughts. Feel comfortable. So welcome again, and thank you, Minja, for giving the talk.
Yes, well, thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to share what I have done so far. So before I start, I want to tell you a bit of a background. So this is something I have developed as a part of my PhD thesis. It was actually the first chapter of my thesis that emerged from the realization that to explore the history of the communist women's movement, I had to go back to the history of the socialist women's movement. And doing that, I realized how connected these women were. And I started experimenting with historical network research, and I saw that historical network research gave me a perspective that otherwise I would not have. Before I go into details about that, I would like to underline one part of the title of the presentation, and that is the question of continuity. Here I say network continuity, but when I say that, it could refer to continuity that is intellectual, that is continuity of personal ties. But what I mean here is structural continuity that I argue played a key role for these two movements. So to give you some context, basically the very common narrative is that the communist women's movement emerged in 1920, and that its emergence was sort of a result or consequence of the creation of the Communist International, which is a revolutionary organization that gathered all these revolutionary parties and gave them a common platform. However, in this research, I ground the emergence of the communist women's movement in the pre-existing network that was created by the socialist women's movement. So I'm giving that movement a sort of a prehistory, showing that it didn't just start existing out of vacuum, but out of this network of women who had 2 decades of shared activist experiences. And this is where I locate this network continuity. And to do so, I combine historical network research with qualitative source analysis and prosopographic analysis. I do this asking how did transnational networks facilitate the continuity of left-wing women's activism between 1906 and 1920? And to answer this question, how, I use network analysis to see the structure that they build. But also to understand the structure, I started researching biographies of all these women who created the network, and to understand how their not only activist trajectories, but also life trajectories shaped the movement itself. And that will be the second part of this presentation. Before I start, I wanted to address some questions that are questions that I keep thinking about and that I find are important to be transparent about. The first one is the question of data and the challenge of historical data. So what I'm doing actually is taking these sources and translating all the information into data that is quantitative. I take conference reports from which I take event participation and create ties out of it, but also I look at correspondence, I look at biographies, However, we have this, for example, conference reports that are very selective. They don't name all the individuals present at events, but in a lot of cases, only important ones, omitting local activists. So what you will see here is something that I call an elite network of the movement, because this is a network of prominent women, but this network was certainly much broader than I managed to recreate for now. And that is something that is important to underline. Also, from 1915 to 1917, there is additional complexity because of the war conditions. Network participation became sort of covert, and a lot of people participated through these underground channels. So that is why the data is hidden, and obviously successfully hidden, because we cannot know the names of all the participants that participated in these events. What I did is look at the local periodicals and local reports. So I managed to discover from very, very different sources who were these women who participated, but again, not all of them. That brings me to the third problem, and that is the question of the archival access and of the languages. So to reconstruct this network is complete as possible, it will be necessary to go to a lot of archives and look at a lot of sources in different languages, which is quite a limitation for one person. What is now quite nice is that with the help of the AI, it is possible to go through historiography of left-wing movements that are, for example, Dutch or I don't know, Scandinavian movements, and to actually locate information that I couldn't locate so far because of the language. So that is one nice development that we got with AI. And the last question is something that I already addressed, but I will just repeat it now. And that is that I realized that historical network research alone doesn't give me the full picture of the history of the movement. It gives me a story of the structure, but to understand the structure beyond network analysis, it was necessary to do this qualitative analysis, and especially prosopographic analysis that gave a lot of information about the history of the movement. So with all that in mind, I am turning now slowly to the network. So for now, I have 77 activists in the dataset. That is not a large number, but considering all the limitations, that's all I could get so far. I like to think about this network as sort of a living biography of a movement, because each time I work on this, I discover new nodes and I keep adding. Like last week when I was preparing this talk, I managed to locate 4 more activists, which doesn't seem like a lot, but in such a small network, it's quite a lot. I traced the connections among these women through 5 international conferences, and I established over 1,600 ties among them. There are 3 types of ties that I use, which is first is event participation that predicts communication, considering that these were very small events, and qualitative analysis of the sources shows that it was very social events with the dinners and informal gatherings where all these women talked. I thought it's quite representative of the network. And also I follow personal connections, personal relations. That is more difficult to follow because, again, it depends on the sources, depends on how we understand personal relations also. But I followed correspondence, and I followed whenever I had the proof that 2 women were in contact outside of the conference, I would establish this personal tie. And the last type of ties that I established is same party membership. And I thought this is quite important because a lot of decisions that were affecting the movement were happening within these cohorts of national party membership. And these women went very often, not always, as delegations of national parties. So I felt that it is also important to mark them in this way. The network analysis actually gave me something that otherwise, like looking at the history of the socialist women's movement, was not so directly visible, And that is the three phases of the development of the movement. The first phase is the growth of the movement that happens between 1906 and 1917. Then there is the wartime crisis and radicalization of the movement that coincides with the first phase, sort of, as you will see later. And then there is partition of the movement that happens between 1970 and 1920 amidst these critical junctures that are First World War and its consequences and two Russian revolutions. So that is the network at a glance, but now I will show you the evolution of the network. So typically, the emergence of the socialist women's movement is situated in the year 1907 at the first International Conference of Socialist Women. But I went to the year ahead and I looked at the Mannheim Conference, which was the conference of German women. It was a fourth German Women's Party conference. And to showcase their movement and the successes of their movement, they invited these international guests, which were already these prominent activists. And this is where sort of this proto-network was created and tested. In a sense, this is the first time these women gathered in such event and shared experiences and then took these experiences across borders. So this is where I followed the origins of the network. You see the black nodes represent the active nodes at that event, and the nodes that are grayish are the women who will join later. I wanted to put it there from the beginning. Then if we go to 1907, which is the conference in Stuttgart, we have the network visibly growing. At this event, we had the participants from the previous conference as well, but we had also in total 59 delegates from 15 countries. So we have this internationalization of the network and official creation of the movement, its institutionalization through the setting up of the Secretariat, which is a body of the movement, the Journal of the Movement, and Clara Zetkin as International Secretary of the movement. Here you can clearly see that we don't have 59 nodes, and that is the problem of the sources and of the data when it comes to this network reconstruction. Going to the next year, 1910, that is the second international conference of socialist women, which gathered almost double amount of delegates, 130 of them from 17 countries. So we have the expansion of the movement, obviously, but this is the conference where we have a lot of local organizers joining and a lot of activists that were not so prominent. So this is why it was very difficult to recover the names of some of the delegates. I managed to do it, and I managed to trace the connections between the previous conference and this one, and we see a certain expansion of the movement here. But what matters most about the Copenhagen conference is that when looking at the correspondence of socialist women, we see that this is the conference that not only produced more ties, but also thickened these ties. They became personal. This is where the friendships that started developing in Stuttgart were quite solidified for some women, and we see the correspondence in meetings outside of the conferences developing after this event. So that is quite important about the Copenhagen conference, especially because it would be 5 years before the next conference would take place. And this network survived 5 years precisely because of these personal ties. And that is one important element to remember, because the next time socialist women gathered in 1915, it was not a very usual gathering. It was a gathering that was happening in this wartime context, and joining this conference was a high-risk activity because many of the women were prosecuted, they were stopped at the border, they were not granted passports on the one hand. On the other hand, they were explicitly forbidden by their national parties to attend this event because it was an anti-war event. So they did it, but not as official delegates of their parties, but as individuals. So this is sort of a high-risk event that was sort of also clandestine, because all the correspondence about the event, not all, but most of it goes through coded language. So we have this coded language also going through this network and through the ties, and that is very interesting. And what matters really with this event is that the majority of women who joined Bern Conference were new to the movement, especially women who came as part of the Russian delegation, and those were Bolshevik women who would push for the radicalization of the movement. So this is a very specific moment in the history of the movement, where Bolshevik women tried to push the movement towards the radical left. However, other women who constituted the majority and who were already embedded in that network for almost a decade pushed away for many reasons. So we here had this tension between these two cohorts already in 1915. So what happened next is that there was not a conference in 1917 in Stockholm. So the background of this event is quite interesting, because there was supposed to be a peace conference in Stockholm, and amidst this conference, Clara Zetkin started organizing with other socialist women another international gathering of socialist women. However, the plans sort of fell through, but not completely, because socialist women, at least a group of them, did gather in Stockholm. The evidence for this exists. For example, delegates from this event, from the conference that is unofficial, or I saw somewhere this conference described as the conference that never was. We have a greeting card sent to Clara Zetkin and some other activists. We have a declaration of the conference. So the event happened, but it gathered very small number of women. Be that as it may, by 1917, we had a network that is quite tight, quite dense. We have short paths among the actors. It is very tightly knit, and women are quite connected. But what happens then is that we have the critical junctures that I mentioned, and we have emergence of new political opportunities. So we have the emergence of communist parties and a new platform, which is Communist International. And what happens is that we have a split of the movement to the women who joined the communist parties and communist women's movement later, and those who stayed within socialist movements, social democratic movements, or joined the extended Socialist Women's International. So before I go into the visualization of this partition, you can see here the trajectory of the conferences and what was happening. So what this graph shows you, that there is sort of a gradual radicalization of the movement over the years, because you can see that over the years, the number of women who would later join Communist Women's Movement started increasing. And what is very interesting is that 78% of these women who joined Communist Women's Movement later also joined Zimmerwald movement. So this is a new discovery that I had, which is that the Zimmerwald movement, which was a movement created in Switzerland as an anti-war movement, which was a general movement, not a women-only movement, actually served sort of as a filter and showed, but sort of implied who were the women who would join the communists. So here, going back to the partition itself, you can see the split within the network. The yellow nodes represent those that stayed within the Socialist, Social Democratic parties. The red nodes represent those who decided that they will join the communist parties and communist movements. If we look at the numbers, we have 50 women who stayed within the old structures and 23 that crossed to communism. In the meantime, 7 of them passed away and 1 withdrew from politics completely. And if we go to the Zimmerwald movement, I tried to trace the connections within it. So we see here the cohort in green that also participated in the Zimmerwald conferences or supported the movement through distribution of leaflets, correspondence, or helping with organizing of the events, but not participating in the events. And we see that they are structured in the same region where the women of the communist women's movement would later be also grouped. When you look at the ties among them, you again see that we are looking at this very tightly knit sub-network that will also continue developing within the communist women's movement. So we see here, and this is the last visualization I want to show you like this, the women who were communists, but also participated in Zimmerwald, they are marked with green. And we have 9 out of 55 who didn't attend the Zimmerwald joining communist women's movement. So we have 14 and 9, which is some of the numbers that mattered in this sense for me. Here, again, you can see the representation, which is numerical between those who joined the communist women's movement, stayed in the socialist women's movement, and that participated also in the network of Zimmerwald. So I took that as one of the filters, and in the end, I reached this network, which is the foundational network of communist women's movement. So this is the pre-existing network from which the movement emerged. So later, when we see the first communist women's conference, we see that most of the women were already connected to each other, that they shared this history of high-risk activism, that they shared ties, they shared experiences, they shared also ideas and organizational practices, and they tested them together. So the movement emerged within this network with a very, very rich legacy, and also ties that were ties of trust and loyalty, which is very important. And they were all connected by their connection to Clara Zetkin, who would become also the secretary of the new movement. So we have also that sort of continuity within it. So I then started wondering what network visualization and analysis gives that historiography does not, for example. And then I looked, for example, the role of Angelika Balabanov, who is a socialist who was a multilingual person participating in all socialist women's conferences, who was established as a secretary of the Zimmerwald movement, and who was one of the secretaries of the Communist International, and even offered a role within the Communist Women's Movement, but she declined it. And this is a woman who really served as a bridge crossing different cohorts, and actually served, when you look at the correspondence, as a bridge between different cohorts of women, between socialist and communist women, between Bolshevik women and the rest of the network. Historiography largely precludes how important she was in this world of the Socialist and Communist International. And I think that network analysis can help us emphasize this, and also point to what needs to be researched and what historiography precluded. So this is the second part of the research, and this is the prosopographic analysis through which, in this section concretely, I try to understand who were the women who joined the Communist Women's Movement and how their characteristics actually shaped their decision. I did prosopographic analysis also of their marital status, of their children, of many different things, but here I decided to focus on only 3 results. So first, I took as a predictor of the crossover their participation in high-risk activism. By high-risk activism here, I meant activism that led to imprisonment mostly, or some repression, but mostly imprisonment. So we see that 61% of women who joined Communist Women's Movement were imprisoned before 1920, especially around 1915, and because of their anti-war activism, in comparison to the 20% of those who did not. Then I analyzed how these women came to be involved within these movements. So I will show you a more finely grained data in the next slides, but basically what it shows is that the women who entered the movement through emigre networks and through underground networks were more likely to join Communist Women's Movement. And lastly, and this is very, very interesting, is that women who decided to stay within the Socialist Women's Movement in large numbers joined institutional politics after 1917, which means that they were members of the parliament, they held offices, one of them became even mayor of London, several of them became ministers, so they chose this path of social democracy and socialism, sort of, that gave them opportunity to practice politics in a different way after 1917. So if we look at the more detailed numbers, we see 61% of those who joined Communist Women's Movement faced state repression. Those who did not join faced, it was 20% of them who faced some kind of a repression, in this case, imprisonment. And communist women also held parliamentary positions. However, that was within Soviet Union and in Germany, and others were doing that in much higher numbers. Also, the women who joined Communist Women's Movement, they joined mostly through underground and emigre networks, and women who did not actually came to activism mostly through their membership in social democratic parties. So here you see also like a more detailed data on how these women joined movements. So we have these networks, we have intellectual mentorship, which means that they met a key figure in socialist movement that draw them to participation. We have some humanitarian work. We have participation in exclusively feminist organizations also that led them to the participation in the Socialist Women's Movement. And we have also participation through party apparatus, actually through party membership. So again, those who were part of the emigre networks were more likely to join communists. Sorry. One last finding that I thought would be interesting to share, however, like I think very open for discussion, is that women who were those who joined the Communist Women's Movement were really closely connected to each other. They had a higher degree. They were connected to also other important figures. So in that sense, they had leverage. And also what is very interesting, and that is something that is important for the debate after the revolution, and that is collaboration between communists and non-communists. We see here that there are at least 47 cross-ideological ties. And we see these women collaborating. And when you look at the interwar period sources, we see that this ideological cut is really not clear, and that these networks of the Socialist Women's Movement actually survive still with some tensions, sometimes with animosity, but they do survive. And what I then found, actually looking at the history of the Communist Women's Movement and their events, is that when the Communist Women's Movement stops existing formally, when their body is is sort of finished, when they don't exist anymore institutionally, the network that was created by the socialist women's movement and continued through the communist women's movement actually serves as a network on which anti-fascist struggles of the 1930s would continue. So there is this element of network continuity in left-wing women's activism that I believe can be traced even later through the Second World War and even after the Second World War, but that is another project. So I have several conclusions and with which I will finish this presentation. And first one is something that I already mentioned, but I think it's quite important, and that is the visibility bias. So I am trying to reconstruct these personal relationships as edges in the network. However, this really depends on the preserved documents. So in a lot of cases, a lot of these women luckily wrote autobiographies or somebody wrote their biographies. So it is sort of possible to retrace them. But again, we are talking about women who were more visible and more prominent in the historiography. This is also makes a question about this statistical analysis of the network, how trustworthy it is because of the sources that shapes it. Then we need to understand that the network was after 1915 semi-clandestine and semi-covert network. So probably there were many more women participating that I managed to trace, obviously, and that's why we have also this limitation in the number of the nodes in the network. And I think this network can be drastically expanded if we look at, for example, correspondence of all these women, and if we expand the scope of the research. And what I want to emphasize is that there is this certain continuity in left-wing women's activism that I already mentioned with the previous slide, and that it is this continuity that we should focus on more than the rupture, and that the proof of the emergence of the communist women's movement serves as a sort of a proof of this network continuity. And I find it as an interesting concept to explore further for the history of the social movements, precisely this network continuity. So I think that with this, I am done with my presentation. So I'm happy to hear your questions and comments.